In the taxi, Maite looked at her hand. The wound was no longer there. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Ignacio asked as the bus moved along the Yucatan highway, leaving a trail of red dust behind. Maite didn't answer, her eyes fixed on an ancient leather-bound journal she'd found among Ignacio's possessions. A forgotten record from 17th century Spanish missionaries documenting linguistic anomalies in Mayan villages, infected by impossible words. A yellowed page mentioned Ichul, a village nearly erased from modern maps. The sun was setting when they arrived at the rundown terminal. Ichul looked like a faded postcard, whitewashed houses with wooden doors in muted colors, skinny dogs dozing in scarce shade, and a silence that seemed to absorb every sound. "It's as if the place is dead," Ignacio muttered as they walked down the main street. The man at the only store eyed them suspiciously. When Maite asked about lodging, he responded in harsh monosyllables, pointing to a house at the end of the street. But when she mentioned local ruins, his face hardened like sun-dried clay. "There are no ruins here, just worthless stones." That night, in a sparse room with 2 cots and a barely functional fan, Maite unfolded the missionary journal's map. According to the notes, less than a kilometer east of the village lay an unrecorded minor ceremonial complex. "This doesn't make sense," Ignacio said, comparing it to modern archaeological maps. "This area has been thoroughly explored." At dawn, they reluctantly hired a local guide, a teenager named Emiliano, who led them through barely visible trails among low vegetation. The boy walked tensely, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "My grandfather says we shouldn't talk near the ancient stones," he said quietly. "The stones listen, but not like people. They listen backward." After an hour of walking, Emiliano stopped abruptly. Before them stretched a natural depression, almost imperceptible. Without the boy's guidance, they would have passed it by. But as they descended the gentle slope, the vegetation subtly changed, revealing carved stones beneath layers of earth and roots. "Incredible," Maite whispered, kneeling to clear a slab. "These are late Mayan structures, but they're not in any record." They spent hours exploring the area, gradually uncovering the outlines of what seemed to be a minor ceremonial center. But the most disturbing aspect was the absolute silence that reigned over the place. Not even their footsteps made a sound on the dry leaves. "Ignacio, say something," Maite urged, suddenly uneasy. The linguist spoke, but his voice sounded muffled, as if absorbed by the air itself. He shouted, and the sound died centimeters from his mouth. Emiliano watched from a distance, unsurprised. At the lowest point of the complex, partially collapsed, they found a crypt. The entrance was blocked by vegetation, but didn't seem intentionally sealed. With improvised tools, they created an access point. Inside was a circular chamber with skeletons arranged in a radial pattern, like the rays of a macabre sun. Each skull faced the center, where an empty depression suggested something had been removed. "Look at their wrists," Ignacio said, his voice trembling. Each skeleton bore jade plaques with inscriptions, the same hybrid code from the tunnel beneath Kukulkan. But what froze Maite's blood was the skeleton nearest the entrance. On its right wrist was a 1990s Casio digital watch, its strap deteriorated but recognizable. "Impossible," Ignacio murmured, pale as lime. "These burials are centuries old. Someone came later." Upon returning to the village, an elderly man awaited them, sitting in front of the store. Without a word, he handed them a piece of embroidered cloth bearing symbols identical to those in the tunnel. His gaze carried ancestral knowledge as he finally spoke. "You're not the first, and what you seek isn't lost, it's hidden." The return to Mexico City passed in near total silence. Maite and Ignacio, each lost in their thoughts, barely exchanged words during the flight. The embroidered cloth the elder had given them remained in a sealed bag, as if both feared touching it directly. The next morning, Maite went to Aina's central offices. Her ID granted access to digital archives on Chichen Itza excavations. But she needed answers about prior interventions, specifically at the base of the Temple of Kukulkan. The archivist, a middle-aged woman with thick-framed glasses, greeted her with bureaucratic formality. "Dr. Herrera, you can use Terminal 3. You have Level B access, sufficient for historical records." Maite entered her credentials and began her search. Excavation records, photographic documentation, preliminary reports. Everything was meticulously cataloged until 1968, then an inexplicable gap until 1981. When she tried accessing the 1970s files, the system displayed the same message: file unavailable, restricted classification. After 2 hours of fruitless attempts, Maite approached the counter again. I need to speak with the head archivist. There's missing documentation. I'm sorry, doctor, but Dr. Melendez isn't available this week, the archivist replied without looking up. You can file a declassification request, though the process takes about 6 months. Maite's lips pressed into a tight line. Something about the woman's demeanor felt deliberately indifferent, as if she were used to giving that response. As she left the building, a figure intercepted her by the main steps, a thin man in his 50s with an ID hanging around his neck. Dr. Herrera, he said quietly. My name is Augusto Ballard, Digital Conservation Department. I think you're looking for information you shouldn't be seeking. Excuse me, the man glanced around nervously. I saw you trying to access the 1970s records. No one looks for those files unless they know exactly what they're after. They walked to a nearby cafe. Augusto ordered a coffee he didn't drink, his fingers tapping constantly on the metal table. There was an unofficial excavation in 1972, he explained finally. It doesn't appear in public records because it never officially existed, but I digitized the few documents that remained. What did they find? Maite asked, leaning forward. I don't know for certain. The expedition was abruptly canceled when 2 archaeologists died, officially from a bacterial infection. Unofficially, Augusto let the sentence hang. The surviving documents are encrypted. I only saw fragments of reports, partially destroyed photos, and a recurring name, Project Eclipse. Maite felt a chill unrelated to the cafe's air conditioning. Project Eclipse, apparently something related to Mayan astronomical patterns, but the strangest part is that it wasn't a purely archaeological project. There were mathematicians, physicists, theorists, even specialists in quantum computing in the 1970s, when that discipline was just beginning. Augusto discreetly slid a USB drive toward her. This is all I could recover. Most of it is corrupted or encrypted, but maybe you can make sense of it. And look for Carmela Nogues in Tepoztlan. She was an administrative assistant on the project. She's still alive, though no one visits her. That same afternoon, Maite discovered her INAH system access had been revoked for routine maintenance. When she told Ignacio over the phone, the linguist fell silent for a long moment before responding. Maite, this goes beyond academic cover-ups. It's as if there's a layer of control above the institute itself, something that transcends the government, as if there's a global interest in keeping certain pasts buried. 3 days later, the taxi dropped them off outside a modest house on the outskirts of Tepoztlan. The mountains stood stark against the evening sky as they walked down the stone path. The door was ajar. They exchanged a worried glance before pushing it open slowly. The interior was methodically ransacked. Drawers open, books scattered, furniture overturned. It wasn't a common theft. It was a systematic search. On the dining table, a partially burned envelope had survived what seemed a hasty attempt at destruction. Inside was a single sheet with a typewritten sentence. The truth isn't buried, it's encrypted. 3 weeks after the failed visit to Tepoztlan, Maite spent sleepless nights deciphering fragments of Project Eclipse documents. The USB files were mostly corrupted, but amid the digital chaos, she found something valuable. A partial map of a restored codex pointing to the location of an undocumented cenote. Xbocob, Ignacio muttered, seeing the coordinates. It doesn't appear in any tourist or archaeological records. The journey to this remote Yucatan region was complicated. They had to rent an off-road vehicle and hire a local guide who, after receiving a hefty sum, finally agreed to take them. During the drive, the man maintained an impassive expression. This place isn't for visitors, he said finally as they stopped before seemingly impenetrable vegetation. The grandparents said the water here doesn't reflect the sky. They descended a barely visible path to a natural depression. Unlike tourist cenotes with their crystal-clear waters and adapted access, Xbocob seemed deliberately abandoned. The cenote's mouth was small, partially covered by vegetation and rocks that didn't appear to have fallen naturally. Someone had tried to seal it. Someone attempted to close this off, Maite observed as they cleared the stones. The guide refused to join them inside, preferring to wait under the shade of a nearby tree, his gaze betraying an ancestral fear. The descent was technically challenging. Once inside, the cenote's main chamber revealed an aquatic system unlike any other. The black water remained perfectly still, as if the natural laws of movement didn't apply. Ignacio shone his flashlight on the walls, revealing something unexpected. Marks of modern tools on the stone. These marks are recent, he pointed out. Someone was excavating here, and it wasn't man archaeologists. Following the marks, they discovered a semicircular opening in the northern wall of the cenote, just above the water level, an entrance to a tunnel. We need the diving gear, Maite decided. An hour later, with oxygen tanks and underwater flashlights, they submerged into the still water. The sensation was unsettling. The liquid felt denser than normal, offering an unnatural resistance to every movement. The tunnel stretched horizontally for several meters before curving upward, emerging into a sealed chamber. The chamber was perfectly circular, with polished walls that didn't seem natural or traditionally Mayan. Most disturbing were the marks at the entrance, deep, parallel scratches in the slippery rock, as if something had tried to escape, clawing desperately at the stone. This doesn't make sense, Ignacio's voice echoed hollowly in the chamber. These marks look like claws, but no known animal would leave this pattern. At the center of the chamber, on a carved stone pedestal, rested an object that didn't fit anything they'd seen before. A sphere, about 20 centimeters in diameter, composed of what appeared to be obsidian and copper interwoven in an impossibly complex pattern. Maite examined it carefully without touching it. The surface bore rotating inscriptions that seemed to shift subtly under the light, as if digital rather than physical. When she brought the flashlight closer, part of the surface reflected the light in a way that defied optical laws. It's like looking at a computer screen, not an ancient artifact, she murmured. Finally, with special gloves, Maite lifted the sphere. Something inexplicable happened. The surface reacted to human contact. The inscriptions spun on their own, aligning into a specific pattern, and a faint light projection emerged from the sphere, forming a three-dimensional symbol in the air. The infinity symbol, but with an anomaly. It was incomplete, as if interference had corrupted it. The return to the surface was frantic, the feeling of violating some fundamental universal law, driving them to move faster than was prudent. Once out of the water, Ignacio began showing alarming symptoms: disorientation, vertigo, and something more unsettling. "Maite, I need to sit," he said, clutching his head. "Are you okay?" she asked, approaching him. But before he could respond, Ignacio looked at her with glassy eyes and spoke in a voice that didn't seem entirely his own. "You're going to ask if I'm okay, and then you'll say we need to leave immediately." A chill ran down Maite's spine. Those were the exact words she'd been about to say. The return to Mexico City was an exercise in controlled paranoia. During the entire journey, Maite kept the sphere wrapped in multiple layers of cloth inside a backpack she never let go of. Ignacio, beside her, alternated between moments of lucidity and times when his gaze seemed lost in an invisible horizon, as if seeing something others couldn't. Dr. Esteban Corrella's laboratory, a specialist in ancient metallurgy, occupied the basement of a nearly abandoned university building due to budget cuts. A burly man with surprisingly delicate hands, Esteban was known for keeping a prudent distance from conventional archaeological theories. "I haven't worked officially for the Institute since 2016, he explained while setting up the analysis instruments. "Let's just say my methods were too experimental for the Scientific Ethics Committee." Under the lab's cold lights, the sphere revealed details impossible to appreciate in the cenote. A surface combining the glassy texture of obsidian with intricate copper filaments forming complex mathematical patterns. But most baffling was the internal rotation system. The outer inscriptions could spin independently like concentric rings, with no visible mechanism enabling it. "This goes against everything we know about pre-Hispanic metallurgy," Esteban murmured, adjusting a digital microscope. "It would require modern technology, millimeter precision, and alloys that simply didn't exist 1,000 years ago." Maite watched silently as Ignacio remained distant, scribbling symbols in his notebook that seemed to replicate those on the sphere. That night, alone in her apartment, Maite obsessively reviewed the recordings from the cenote. On her laptop screen, the images of the black water and the walls marked by unknown tools felt even more disturbing than in person. Then she noticed something. She rewound the video frame by frame. For a fraction of a second, in the water's reflection, her own image moved before she did. She froze the frame. It was imperceptible at normal speed, but undeniable in slow motion. Her reflection anticipated her movements by milliseconds. Her phone buzzed on the table, startling her. It was Esteban, his voice frantic, words tumbling over each other. "You need to come now. The results? This is impossible, Maite. Impossible." 30 minutes later, under the flickering lab lights, Esteban showed data tables and spectrometry graphs on his monitor. "The metal has no carbon dating," he explained, hands trembling. "Not because it's too ancient. It has no dating at all, as if it was never part of Earth's natural material cycle." He slid a printed sheet toward her. "And the copper contains traces of elements that don't exist in pre-Hispanic Mexico. Elements that shouldn't exist anywhere. Some don't even appear on the periodic table. I've run the tests 7 times." The revelation hung between them like a physical presence. The object wasn't ancient or modern. It seemed to exist outside the known timeline.